Hi, welcome to A Century of Radio Interviews for PlaylistResearch.com. I'm Alex Cosper, and my site Playlist Research explores the history of music and radio, and today I want to talk about WHFS. I used to write for this magazine called Virtually Alternative, and it was never on the street. It was just a radio and music trade industry magazine funded by record label ads. And I wrote for this magazine from 1997 to 2001, and it was that's the year it went out of business. But it was a thrilling magazine at the time. And this issue, December 2000, I wrote most of it, and it's a tribute to Washington, D.C. radio station WHFS, which was legendary from the 60s through the 2000s. In the late 60s, it started playing freeform, progressive music, and sometime in the 70s, it started shifting more to a rock format. And then in the 80s and 90s, it kind of bounced around from rock to alternative. And eventually it went off the air in 2008. But many, many years. And this magazine is a 30-year anniversary of HFS going progressive. So once again, I wrote most of this issue, and part of it was interviewing lots of people who worked here, and one of those persons was Steve Leeds from the music industry and originally the radio industry. He was the producer for the famous Murray the K, who helped promote the Beatles back in 1964. Murray the K, after that, moved on to other stations and was actually hosting a show on WHFS in the early 70s. So here's the phone interview I did with Steve back in 2000 about WHFS. Steve starts off by talking about how he went from college radio to working as producer for Murray the K.
I went to a school at American University in Washington, D.C. Junior year and senior year as station manager. I guess sophomore year, I answered a little card on an index card that was posted on the station bulletin board. Production assistant wanted for Murray the K. Acid rockers need not apply. And I called and got an interview, and I did something not nice. I took the card off the wall to make sure no one else would take the job. And I had to go home that weekend when I came back, and I met with him. And it was, in fact, for Murray the K, who at the time was working at an AC station known as WWDC, AM station of what today is DC 101. And worked there with Murray for probably, I'm going to guess, a year and a half. And then he got a deal where he bought 3P to 7P on WHFS. He leased the time. In exchange, he could sell it, sell advertising during that time.
Mm-hmm.
Brought me with him as his quote-unquote producer. He quickly realized, because it was a mom-and-pop facility, he was going to need a board op, because he was always used to working with a board op. And I got at the time, I guess he was my roommate yet, a friend of mine who worked at the college station who ran a very tight board named Weasel to be the board op. At the time, HFS was a very, 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 very alternative station in the truest sense.
Right, freeform.
But it had a playlist, but the playlist was play anything that wasn't commercially you know, it was more of a singer-songwriter organic station. That's not to say they didn't play the early Fleetwood Mac. Steve Miller band was certainly a staple at the station. I mean, long before Bonnie Raitt or John Prine meant anything on the national scene, they had a strong following in the Baltimore, Washington area.
Mm-hmm.
And so the jocks were selected not for their on-air professionalism, but their ability to be musicologists and segue songs that were similar in key. So you could have flows of anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours of music that would just flow endlessly, and you couldn't tell where one song ended. One definitely kind of like what mixed show jocks, I guess, pride themselves in today. The station was owned by Jake Einstein and Alvin Jeweler and a couple of investors, and Jake was the business side of the station, and Jake's two sons worked at the station. David Einstein, who was the PD, and his brother Damon held down various slots. When I was working there, he used to do evenings.
And what year was this?
This was the early 70s. This is, you're talking probably 70, 71.
Okay. So what was your role at this time?
Okay, so I was just like a hired gun working for Murray the K as his producer. And I weaseled a internship from the station, the general manager, Alvin Jeweler, as part of my undergrad studies at American. And part of it was to help, at the time, the station's license renewal process. And so I would have to participate in the community ascertainment hearings, or have to analyze the needs of the greater Bethesda, Maryland community, if you will. Murray, concurrent with this, was living with a attractive model named Judy Black in Washington, D.C. And he quickly brokered the morning show.
Okay.
Now here's Judy, who had never really been on the air, less know anything about, progressive rock circa 1972 or whatever it was. But he, was selling commercials to local merchants as well as to the record labels. And of course, it was my job to make sure that those labels that were heavy buyers were at least represented on the shows with music. In fact, Murray had a pretty clever thing. He would sell a thematic block of music to a label. Probably the direct antecedent to pay-for-play, if you will.
Yeah.
Like, Elektra would buy a half hour, and it was my job to program a set of music from the Elektra library of music, emphasizing obviously the new releases, but all that worked within a thematic set.
And did you pre-record it or do it live?
We'll do it live with Murray, but I'd have to program it.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, I guess Murray got an offer to come back to New York and do weekends at WNBC, which eventually led to a full-time return to him to New York radio, because at the time Bob Pittman had left. It was Wolfman Jack, Cousin Brucey, and Murray the K. So at that point, I was offered the overnights. So this is now 1972. So Damon Einstein was on before me. Then it was me from midnight to 6, and then Judy Black would do 6 to 10.
So she didn't follow Murray the K to New York?
No, eventually he was commuting back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I think my air name at the time was, you'll love this, I thought Steve Leeds sounded too radio friendly. Steve Leeds was like, the perfect top 40 jock. So the antithesis of that, because I'm working at, a pretty avant-garde radio station, so I used the name Herschel Chickowitz. Don't ask me where that came from or anything. I just plucked the weirdest name I could out of the air.
Okay.
I was using it on my college station.
So on your show, did you play whatever you wanted?
Oh, I remember playing, I may remember playing Walter Carlos, Sonic Seasoning, which was an electronic mood piece. I remember playing the Plastic Ono live John Lennon and Yoko Ono with Frank Zappa and the Mother's Invention at the Fillmore. You know, I segue sides of John Fay and Leo Kottke and just challenge myself, see how long I could keep the segues going.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like, you know, it was like a little club. I mean, the station had started as some leased broker time and eventually had gone full time, except on the weekends when, and this is how Weasel started. Weasel was hired to do the weekend programming. It was running tapes or board hopping for the Korean Hour, the Italian Hour, the Jewish Music Hall. The shows were usually run by an ethnic personality who had very little or poor command of the English language. But Weasel would get along with those people. And so he honed his chops as a tight board op, but at the same time, he had the uncanny ability of, you know, jumping from the Italian guy, you know, to the Korean guy without them taking issue, because they would inevitably blame the board op if something didn't go right. But he seemed to muddle through it all and do well, and that's how he first, you know, got into the station as a board op, because he ran the weekend programming. So when I left,
What year did you leave?
it was the end of the summer of 1972.
Okay.
I was going to Syracuse University to get my grad degree, and I told the GM that I was leaving. So I gave him like notice back in June and told him, look, I'm taking a week in July to go find a place to live. And he gave me the week off, and I went up and I found student housing and whatnot. And when I came back, I told him, I said, look, I'm leaving in about 6 weeks. And he said, no, you can't do that. I said, what do you mean? We're going to make you a star. Now, in those days, I was getting paid an hourly fee, so I was probably taking home $60, $70 a week. And they were very upset. He said, well, what are we going to do? Who are we going to put in this air shift? I said to him, well, why not put Weasel? He said, Weasel? What are you, nuts? I go, why not? He runs a tight board. Everybody likes him. Weasel. Thought never occurred to him. Anyway, they put him on, and I think he was on there for up until Robert Benjamin made a shift change maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah, I interviewed him. So after leaving HFS, then you continued at Syracuse and...
While I was in D.C., I also worked at WGTB,
Okay.
Georgetown's college station. That was fun, because that was a non-commercial FM station. Our college station was just on the campus. Then I went to Syracuse, and then I worked... I was the first grad student that was allowed to participate at WAER, which was the university's student-run FM station at the time, and the undergrads couldn't like fathom the fact that there was some grad student who actually like could fit into their corporate culture.
So at that point, you kind of thought you might be in radio as a career?
I didn't, you know what? I didn't know what I was doing. I guess I thought it was optional. I mean, I went to grad school for a degree in TV radio, so I would say you're probably right.
At what point did you decide to get into the music business?
Well, that's a quick funny story. After I graduated, I came back to New York and I started working again for Murray. I was wearing a suit, and I was in the Time Warner building, whatever it is now. And I ran into the guy who ran the college department in Atlantic, and he sees me wearing a suit with a haircut. He goes, "What the hell's going on?" I said, "Well, I just got out of school and I'm looking at, Warner Cable. Maybe there's a job for me." He goes, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, I need a job." He goes, "Well, we might have one." And I quickly found myself being interviewed for the local New York City promotion job for Atlantic Records. Now, concurrent with that, I was working for Murray at WNBC in New York, and I met the local guy, and I quickly realized that this guy was about to get blown out. He didn't know it, and I was being offered his job. They hired me as the local, right out of school, I was the local New York Atlantic guy, making $250 a week and living at home. I had various job titles at Atlantic, including being part of their first FM rock department, then the reactivated Atco Records. Then I went indie for 4 years. I was the first independent album promotion guy. Bruce Mosher right after me. Then I took a job doing head of East Coast A&R for MCA, like 81, 82.
Okay.
Irving Azoff came in, pretty much cleaned house. Another great story for some other article. Went to work for a management company, Lieber Krebs. At the time, they were handling AC/DC, Def Leppard, Aerosmith, and Joan Jett. And then I left there and went to work. I was offered a job by Johnny Barbas at Island. Well, at the time it was called Polygram Label Group. They made me head of alternative and video. And then I left what morphed into Island to go start a little label with Doug Morris. And at the time, Daniel Glass, called Rising Tide, which within 3 months morphed into Universal.
And that's where you've been since, huh?
Yes.
Great. All right, Steve, is there anything you'd like to add, any other memories you have about HFS?
The other, there's some jocks there that have went on. There were heritage jocks, if you will. Surf, he did evenings on WHFS. He was probably the star of the station. And he would open up his show every night with the Rolling Stones song 2120 South Michigan Avenue. It was an instrumental. And he always had a rap. Let me see if I got this rap down. Surf, we're sending out some tunes tonight for all the little ladies, for the truckers, the Mad Hatters, the ships at sea, and especially the little ladies of the night. This Surf, and I'll be here playing rock and roll music for you for the next couple of hours, and boom, he'd just go. And he was the guy. He was probably one of the longest ongoing jocks they had at the station, other than Weasel.
Okay.
I mean, the core of the station was David Einstein, who used to do like middays, like 10 to 2 or 9 to 1, whatever it was. Then there were different people doing afternoons. The guy when I started there, he was the production manager, and I think he does an agency business down there. It was named Steve Walker. And then this guy Surf, and then Damon, and then Weasel. It was the first station that I ever knew that broadcast in quad.
Quadraphonic, yeah. That's what quad was named after in Sacramento. It's quadraphonic stereo.
We used to broadcast the Columbia discrete quad records that required a special stylus. It was matrixed. There was a decoder. I just remember in the control room we had 4 different speakers. Some of the jocks would get into stoned raps and go, "Hey, listen, I'm inside your radio right now, and I can really take control. You know that little red dot that says stereo? I can make that go off and on. Watch this." And they'd hit the stereo pilot, but for the transmitter control, and you could, make the station go to mono. Freak people out.
Didn't you have to have quadraphonic receiver?
Receiving equipment here in quad, so that was the whole joke. Was like, so they were trying to sell, stereo equipment.
Didn't work though, huh?
Oh, it didn't work, but I mean, the station was like, quad, but I mean, the station was very non-promotion oriented anyway, so, it just sort of fell by the wayside.
Were you there to hear HFS sign on in the beginning?
When I got there, there were 2 stations playing progressive music. There was WMOD, which had a couple hours a day of progressive music, and then HFS had this leased broker time, and they had a show every night called Through the Looking Glass with Mark and Sarah, a guy and a girl. And they were like the artsy freaks of the time. They had the whole Georgetown scene wired, and they had a couple hours a day where they would program this kind of, at the time, what was called progressive rock music. And that expanded, and I think the station eventually saw the interest from an audience, because, I mean, the station was leased access at the time. I think HFS stood for High Fidelity Stereo. And like I said, it was originally a small a small stick in Bethesda, Maryland, or 2.3, I think. The other thing is, back then, most of the spots were either, produced by the Jocks or read live. And the one thing that the sales manager had going from Jake Einstein, he would sell things called safety spots, which was like a 20-second PSA followed by two 20-second commercials. So it was a way of getting people on the air who really weren't able to normally buy advertising on a radio station. So it'd be something like this: motorists, remember, a rolling ball is usually followed by a running child. This message brought to you by the Funky Leather Company in Georgetown. This week, Chukka Boots on sale at blah, blah, blah. And Eddie Leonard Sandwich Shop, open all night for the best, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, it's hysterical.
Hmm.
I have tons of those things, just tons of that clutter. And the other cool thing, and Surf was the expert, is we would have, because he would, do music sweeps of, play an hour. So they'd have to run, maybe 10 minutes of spots. He would interject in the spot breaks fake commercials. Like we'd card them up from the Firesign Theater,
Yeah.
or the Conception Corporation, or just anything. So, you just mix it in just to make it entertaining.
And was it entertaining or was it clutter?
I think everything the station did at the time, because it was so homegrown, was really, really entertaining. And plus, you got to remember Washington, D.C. then. This is during the Nixon years, right?
Okay.
So you had the Vietnam marches were going on down there, and it was a pretty active political scene. So,
Did HFS try to reflect the politics at that time?
they really didn't. I don't even remember us having news of any consequence. There was a teletype, and I think once in a while something, but oh no, I take that back. I think we carried one of the network newscasts a couple of times a day. I want to say AP. It was just depending on whoever the station could cut the better, barter deal with. But it was not there wasn't a sense of that. It was the rallying point for people to hear music and when somebody was in town. Like John Prine would live there. Just people would always just stop by. It was just like, if you were a music fan, you always went by there because it was it. The promotion men loved the station because we'd literally add everything. There'd be huge bins in the studio of all the new releases. Now, what got played was another story. That was there for your awareness and enjoyment, should you choose. A lot of people, I remember Surf used to have tons of these crates made of plywood with his own personal stuff in there and stuff that he'd bring in. Because a lot of the stuff we played was from independent labels. We used to play a lot of Alligator records, a lot of blues, and a lot of organic stuff. As commercial as we got was we played Jim Croce. We would never play Time Bottle. We play You Don't Mess with Jim. And as soon as that we got any, other airplay in the market, it was like, goodbye.
And that was because he was lyrical and it was a singer-songwriter type station.
Yeah, it was the word, I think, organic. It was stuff music that was, made out of passion and not out of finance. We were all naive enough to think that, you'd never hear Yes.
Okay, that was too slick and produced.
None of that music, Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
What about since Murray the K was there, what about some really psychedelic Beatles type stuff from Sgt. Pepper?
Funny enough, I worked for Murray there. We premiered a couple of things. One is we were the first station in the market to have the Bangladesh album. We were also the first station in the market to have the Imagine album. And he flew me to New York to pick up those albums from the legendary Apple promotion guy, a guy named Pete Bennett. He also, Pete gave me as like a throwaway, said, here, take this, kid. He gave me an acetate of Merry Christmas, The War is Over. So those are things Murray had that no one else had, And prior to that, there was a jock in town who now works at Hitmakers, Barry Richards, and he was working on a very, very hip alternative AM station in suburban Maryland. And heretofore, he had been the guy. And as soon as Murray came, he would just flex his muscles and use his clout. I mean, think about it. Bangladesh was a charity album. I mean, it was a big hoo-ha to get it early. Not only get it early, but I remember going and picking up a station wagon full of albums, and we gave them away. Which was like, at the time, like, wow. So, I mean, Murray had his connections. He got a great interview with John and Yoko, which he played back and sold, I think, the Coca-Cola things as a sponsor, which was pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, did Murray the K pull any numbers for HFS?
You know what, Alex? I don't believe he was there long enough. And you got to understand, the station had nothing to do with ratings. I don't ever remember anyone ever talking, discussing. I don't think I knew anything about ratings until years later when I went to work for Atlantic Records. It was just not even a factor. First, I'm sure the station didn't have the wherewithal to buy the book. And they never sold the station on ratings. It was sold on performance. I mean, if they had to have Weasel do a remote, I mean, the station was filled with sponsors like, you know, the local concert promoters and the record companies. I mean, that was it. And, you know, and of course there was some national buys thrown in for movies and whatnot. But I mean, it was very much based upon local ad sales in the local community. You know, it delivered. I mean, it was the state. I mean, if you wanted to reach that audience, that was the place to go.
Was there any conflict with the station and Murray the K on his approach? Or
oh yeah. I mean, the other jocks hated it and they thought Murray was jive, but they also understood he was bringing in a big chunk of change into the station. And look, what could David Einstein say? He's the PD. His father's the business manager, you know, sales manager. His father made that decision. So I mean, as long as I was involved, they knew that it wasn't going to get too stupid. And there were times where they'd go, Steve, please don't play that, you know. So I'd go, okay, don't play that, you know.
So you controlled the musical content of the show?
Well, ultimately Murray did, but he would be, I don't know, for whatever reason, he would respect me enough to, like, you know, leave it alone unless there was something he felt he needed to do. I mean, listen, his tradition was he would always open up his show with a Sinatra song, with Frank Sinatra. He was hip enough and understood enough of the market that he didn't do that there because he knew it wouldn't work. By the way, I have a poster. He did a show. He did a show at the Kennedy Center during that time period with Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley.
By then, at that point, was early rock and roll considered a dinosaur?
Again, at that station, Chuck Berry was something that was cool.
Okay. Because he was an innovator, a pioneer.
And Muddy Waters, you know, the whole anything on chess was pretty hip at that time.
Okay, so is that the oldest stuff you would play is like Chuck Berry or Muddy Waters?
I remember people playing Bill Haley and the Comets, but I mean, they'd go back and play. We'd play Bessie Smith. We'd play. There was this album on Columbia. We played the hell out of it, called Uptown Saturday Night at the Apollo, and it had a lot of risque music at the time. I mean, I want a hot dog for my roll. You know, like I said, anything go. You'd go from Bonnie Raitt to Bessie Smith to Hound Dog Taylor to some Jimi Hendrix. You know, it would just all flow.
What about Zeppelin?
Yeah, they'd play Zeppelin. Clapton, tons of Birds, Dylan, Donovan, horn bands like Murray used to love playing Chase and Blood, Sweat and Tears in Chicago. Those wouldn't get played. Van Morrison, huge artist at HFS. Now you think about it, this is the Warner Brothers era. This is the Moondance album. You know, Astral Weeks, big stuff. I mean, Warner Brothers had the artists, and Randy Newman, the local Warner Reprise guy. He had a field day. He would just walk in there and they'd almost gobble everything up. So Allman Brothers, certainly.
Mm-hmm. So did you think HFS contributed to album sales in the market during that period?
It did. Listen, I mean, like I said, you know, an artist like Bonnie Raitt, you know, D.C. and Baltimore were strong markets for, as was John Prine. Little Feat are still a huge factor in that market, even to this day. I remember us selling Mose Allison albums. Nils Lofgren and Grin, is from the area. That was tough. His music, he got some airplay, but I don't think he ever got justice. Bruce Springsteen, long before he meant anything anywhere else, long before Born to Run, was like, the first two albums, I guess it were played there a lot.
All right, Steve, I think we've covered a lot here. Is there anything else that you want to add?
I think it's a very, actually, you know what? It's a very unique situation that really helped shape the marketplace, and I think there's still, a residual impact today. I think most of those listeners now understand what HFS has had to become to be, commercially viable. And then, when Dwight Douglas put on DC 101, I guess it was Dwight and Dave Brown. That sort of, opened the door for the more commercial aspects of rock. And so, I remember Foreigner and Firefall, and those bands could actually get airplay in that market. Where previously it was like no one was going to play a Foreigner record in DC.
Okay, I have one more question, and it relates to, since you have a radio background and a record industry background, do you think today's alternative radio format is a little too tight, or what's your feeling about it?
Well, I was very upset with one of the trade publications when they decided to throw LIR out of the format, because they said that they weren't a true alternative station because they were integrating dance songs.
Like from Top 40?
They were playing, unfortunately, most of them were mine. Alice DJ and Eiffel 65 and stuff like that.
Well, Eiffel 65 charted on alternative.
Well, my point is, Alex, is like, I think the trades have contributed to the narrow casting of what's an acceptable genre that can be included. Alternative, by its very nature, should be something different, unique. And what's alternative in Sacramento is definitely different than what's alternative in Long Island. And there's nothing right or wrong about either one of those. It's just that's the way it is. And I think we've kind of boxed ourselves into this narrow, defined, format of that this is what is alternative. Anything outside of those parameters really isn't alternative anymore. And I was like, well, who died and made you king to decide that? Whoever they are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's frustrating, because I got into it, as I'm sure you did, as I'm sure most people who read the article at the end of the day, because they were passionate about some music, got them excited, and, emotionally involved them. And now it seems to be, more of something else and not about the music. I don't know. The motivation was way different back then.
Right.
We weren't looking to do a concert.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve.
I'm sorry I wasn't home earlier, Alex.
Oh, it's okay, no problem. And of course, this comes out in December,
Right.
and we're interviewing a lot of
I
people.
have some pictures I got to send Jonathan.
That's perfect. Yeah, just send it to Jonathan L. or John Eastdale. Do you have their email addresses?
Yeah, no, I got the photos I'm going to have to give them.
Okay, then that'll work.
Okay,
Thanks a lot, Steve.
cool.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.